to Frontline Dispatches on Organizing Upgrade, a show dedicated to spotlighting the most urgent left organizing and activism happening around the country and beyond for racial and economic justice. And stay tuned for future episodes of Frontline Dispatches every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, so that's 6 p.m. Central and 4 p.m. Pacific. My name is Jayanni, and I will be today's host. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please leave comments in the chats. We'll be monitoring those as the show goes along. And if you haven't yet, give Organizing Upgrade a like and a subscribe to this channel. And finally, to stay up to speed with all the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade, sign up at our website. That's organizingupgrade.com to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. Okay, let's get into it. So I'm so honored today. My guest is Sendolo Diaminah, coming to you from the Carolina Federation in North Carolina. Sendolo is an organizer, a trainer, a strategist who has also held elected office. So we're going to welcome them at this time. Hi, Sendolo.
Hey, fam. How you doing?
I'm good. It's so good to be in conversation with you tonight. So I want to talk to you about the election and particularly what's taking place in North Carolina. So naturally, we know that the presidential election has been called for Biden-Harris, and North Carolina was incredibly a close race. So what's the state of the election in North Carolina currently, and what have you been focused on since Election Day?
Yeah, so you're right. The numbers haven't finally come in for North Carolina, though our expectation right now is that we're not going to be able to close the gap in the presidential race. But it's actually not over here in North Carolina for some other really key races. So our state Supreme Court, the Chief Justice is this Black woman, Sherry Beasley, first Black woman who is the Chief Supreme Court Justice for our state Supreme Court. And she is closing in on her opponent from the right. And we're actually really excited about the possibility and the likelihood of her actually overtaking her opponent. So actually continuing to count the ballots is a really important thing that's still going on in our state. And that office is really key because our redistricting process is controlled by our state Supreme Court, or what I should say is the state Supreme Court is such a key check on our state legislature, who time and time again, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, and as you know, North Carolina has been a petri dish for all of their gerrymandering and voter suppression. So that's a race that is still going on for us. And then there are a number of other really critical races, like our folks in Guilford County. Shout out to Guilford for All, one of our chapters with the Federation, was able to flip the county commission there, but one of our races came down to just 18 votes. And so we anticipate that that will be challenged and we'll need to be out there fighting. So the election isn't actually over. We're not going to get final numbers at the county level canvas until the end of this week. Tomorrow's the last day that marked ballots can come in. So we're still actually in this election fight, though in many of the races we know or we have a pretty good sense of what's happening.
Excellent. Yes, and good luck with the local races that y'all are still fighting to win. That Supreme Court race sounds incredibly pivotal for the work that y'all are doing in North Carolina. I want to return back to something you said about the state legislature and that this one race is going to be really decisive in order to keep the state legislature in North Carolina in check. And for many watching the state races, it appears that the right has kind of advanced its stronghold locally and at the state level. Can you talk about what that means and what that looks like in North Carolina?
Yeah. So we have been fighting to transform our state
think you might have paused a bit, Sendolo. We're going to give you a few seconds to come back. So again, for those who are tuning in, we are in conversation with Sendolo Diaminah of the Carolina Federation. It is an independent political organization in the state of North Carolina. And so Sendolo is talking with us currently about the fact that their election is not over, despite the presidential election being called for Biden-Harris, that there's some key local races that are going to be pivotal to what comes next. So we're going to try to get Sendolo back on the line. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for bearing with these technical difficulties tonight. I also want to continue to encourage people to post in the chat. So if you're watching, hello, thank you for tuning in. Please post comments in the chat so that we can lift them up. And so I also want to kind of talk about some of the continuing election results that are rolling out across the country. So we do have Sendolo back, but again, like I said, the presidential election has been called for Biden-Harris, but the right has managed to advance on local and state levels. And so we kind of want to hear what that looks like in North Carolina. So Sendolo, welcome back. Let us know your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah. So part of our analysis at the Carolina Federation is that the state level of our government in this country is actually like the key. From the state level, there's control both upwards into Congress and downwards in terms of our local government. So we think control of the state is really, really at the center of the kind of political power we need to be building. And so just to be really, really honest, we felt like this year was going to be a year where we're going to be able to make some real advances and get majorities in our General Assembly. And that was really beaten back. We were not able to make those advances. There were some small losses that we had. We were able to prevent a retaking of the General Assembly with a supermajority for the right, but we were not able to capture a majority on our side, inside of our united front. And so what that means is they've been very, very clear that they're coming out hard and they're on a war path in order to attack our organizations and attack our people. It means that they're going to be up to redistricting again, and they're going to be trying new methods of gerrymandering to see what they can get away with, especially with the new Supreme Court federally. It means that we're going to continue to be under pressures and under limitations with them, even though we were able to keep our Democratic governor. Things like Medicaid expansion, things like response to COVID, things like funding for our schools, all of these different pieces are going to continue to be places where the right is coming for us. So that is one of the consequences that we think we're facing. And at the same time, it's been really important for us to remind our people that even though we weren't able to make the advances that we wanted to, actually this year we saw such a massive expansion of the right-wing base, and that the work that we did wasn't for nothing. If we hadn't done the work that we did, we would actually be talking about supermajorities sweeping back in charge of our General Assembly, and that would have meant that our governor couldn't veto things. So the governor's veto and the state Supreme Court control that our folks have are the two checks that we're able to put on the General Assembly. And that comes from the work that our people have been doing for the last decade. And it comes from the massive mobilization that our people were engaged in this cycle in order to massively expand the number of people who are participating in the political process.
Wow, I think that's amazing. And what you talked about in terms of like the decade of work that's been ongoing across many of our movements that have gotten us to this particular point, and how that kind of set the groundwork in order to make sure that we didn't see these sweeping supermajorities across the states. Can you tell us about who you were trying to move to the polls? How many voters did you talk to? What were your learnings from kind of being on the front lines in this first presidential election for the Carolina Federation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually came in, this is our first year where we were engaging in statewide electoral organizing. The Carolina Federation is just 2 years old. We got started in 2019. And so 2020 was our first big fight. And our original goal was to have 30,000 conversations. And it was really important for us to make a distinction between attempts, right? Knocks or dials, and actual conversations that we had with people to actually have discussion about what's going on and get them involved. So we had a goal of 30,000. And as our field program got into place, as our amazing field director, field organizers, regional field directors were connecting our long-term base building organizing to the electoral work, we just actually saw those numbers increase significantly. And so we ended this campaign with over 80,000 conversations, way above what we had originally planned to do. And some of that was also the result of our national partners who said, we want to call in, we want to be a part of what's happening in North Carolina. And like, you know, I just think it's really powerful. A lot of people have this idea of electoral work or phone banking as just this grind or these things where you just go through numbers, go through people, and it's not depthful. But part of what we saw is that the experience of coming together, facing the challenges that we're facing in this moment, building relationships in state, but also people from all over the country was an exciting thing for people. Folks built new relationships, folks built new friendships, and our phone banks were places where we built playlists and connections that have lasted. So we were able to really increase the number of people who we spoke to, and the range of people we were really looking to talk to. We talked about them in a number of different ways. Often in electoral work, people will say there's our get out the vote universe, people who we think share our values and our politics, but who are deeply skeptical about participating in elections and don't do so frequently. Mm-hmm. And then there's a group that gets talked about as the persuasion universe, the folks who participate in the electoral process, but don't have conflicting ideas about where they stand in terms of the political questions in front of us. And often Black people, people of color, working class people are put in the get out the vote universe, and people are like, oh, we only need to talk to those people right before election and just tell them to turn out. We don't need to have any real conversations with them. And a lot of the time, money, and energy gets put into the persuasion universe, which in many places gets talked about as more white, more suburban, et cetera. And we were really like, we need to talk to both. And both need to be serious conversations. And we talked about them both as persuasion universes. We had our persuade to vote universe, and then we had our persuade to candidate universe. And both of those conversations were about deeply understanding what's going on with people, what are they seeing, what are they longing for, what are they frustrated with, and how do we create a vision and a path and an organization that people understand isn't just here to get their vote, but is part of a long-term project that's going to be there before, during, and after. So we were having conversations largely in the 4 counties that we're in: Durham County, Guilford County, New Hanover County, and Forsyth County. And those are spread out across the center part of our state and the eastern part of our state. And then we have partners like down home North Carolina, who was having conversations specifically in small town and rural counties, which are a critical part as we are looking at these elections. If we're not moving people in those places, having real connecting conversations that transform who they're understanding as the real opponents in this moment and who they're understanding as their real allies, we're not going to make it happen just by talking to the people who already agree with us. We have to be engaging both working class folks of color and the folks of color and white folks and working people in rural and small towns. Like that whole range are people who we need to be engaging. And then, of course, we also had allies who were focusing almost exclusively in suburban neighborhoods, et cetera. But our organization actually had the full range in terms of the people who we're trying to talk to, because we think if we're going to govern society, we need to be talking to everybody, and we need to be thinking about what does it take to build a majority, and how do we build strategies and stories that can build that majority right now. So we were talking to a whole range of people.
I wholeheartedly agree, and hearing just the amount of labor and strategy that went into expanding the Persuasion Universe of voters. 80,000 people contacted in North Carolina is absolutely amazing. And I think it doesn't, the numbers nationally that show that North Carolina was just a leaning red actually don't get to this story of what's happening on the ground. Can
I say something about that, Jayanni?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to say, because I think some of our people in state are feeling this, and I think around the country, once the result comes in, people are like, oh, they're red, or oh, they're blue. And I just really want to say that in 2016, Clinton lost North Carolina by 173,000 votes. Then this year, Biden lost, well, when we, our latest numbers, the gap is 73,000. And I just really want to put that out there, that like what's actually happening is our people are gaining ground, and it's not gaining ground staying in place. The Trump base increased by 374,000 people. Our base increased by 474,000 people, right? So this isn't a thing where it's like, oh yeah, North Carolina, same old thing. Things are changing and transforming, and we have to be really attentive to that to remind our people it is working. We are on the path towards winning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I think there are other incredible lessons coming out of North Carolina. What are some of the other lessons about, in particular, I want to return to the question of having a rural strategy and organizing folks in rural areas, but then also not discounting the organizing that you have to do with Black communities and with people of color communities. Can you tell us why you all were motivated to take that on in particular?
Yeah, I think there's two pieces that I want to share. The first one is just strategic. You just look at the maps, you look at the numbers. There's no way it's going to happen. There's no way it's going to happen that we're going to see the transformation. We're going to get the majorities that we need without engaging our comrades and our brothers and sisters who are in rural and small town areas. That's just absolutely essential strategically. But then I think there's a ethical, a spiritual, a moral question of, are we going to abandon our folks to right-wing ideology? Are we going to abandon people who, like folks in urban areas, are suffering from the politics, from the economics, from the greed of the folks who have been governing our society? Are we going to abandon them? And to me, I think that there is a lack of confidence among some of our comrades where we're like, we think that white supremacy is more convincing than freedom. We think that white people or rural people or whoever can't be transformed, can't be won over. And I think we have to believe enough in our vision and believe enough in what we have to offer and believe enough in our own capacities for transformation to have the confidence to say, we're going to go for it and we're going to try to move our people. And for me, as a Black person, as a queer person, like, it wasn't like the people in my family when I was growing up were like, oh yes, queer stuff, let's get into it. That is a process of transformation. And it was a choice for me to say, I'm not abandoning or relinquishing my people to homophobia. And similarly, we refuse to relinquish our people, working class people, rural people, to white supremacy. That doesn't mean we're going to get everybody, and we don't need everybody. But I don't think that means that we categorically just reject folks. I think it means we make a play for every single part of this society, and we say, you belong with us.
Wow, deeply, deeply inspiring. And we have a couple of questions that are coming from the chat. And so I'm going to lift up a few there. Yeah, so Mike says that this is tremendously inspiring work. What was effective in the persuasion conversations? And how do you think about training organizers to have those conversations. Could you speak to and say a little bit more about the structure of the Carolina Federation?
Sure. So I think those are actually connected. Part of what really works for our people is that we weren't calling on behalf of just a candidate, and we weren't calling just on behalf of one of the existing parties. We were calling as a permanent organization in that community. And we had an endorsement process that we went through. And we talked to people about which candidates we endorsed and why we endorsed them. We also talked about what was going on locally. And by talking about building independent political power, a lot of the folks in the Persuade to Vote universe, the Persuade to Vote category of people were like, okay, I want to hear that. And that honesty of like, yes, we are also disgusted by the way that this political system works, which people don't expect, right? You get on the call and they're like, oh, y'all trying to call me about this nonsense, election, blah, blah, blah. And we say, yeah, right. It gets really frustrating talking about this. And we have the same feelings about that. Let's start with an acknowledgement of the corruption of our existing political system. And then folks are like, okay, you're not trying to bamboozle me. Let's have a real conversation. I think it's also really, really important in our Persuade to Vote conversations to talk about the range of issues and the personal experiences that brought each of us to the table. So all of our volunteers, part of the process is for them to identify what's your self-interest. This isn't a conversation where you're calling somebody as an anonymous phone banker. You are a human being who needs to be clear about what your investment is. So when this person is asking you, why should I take a risk? Why should I say, let me try something that I've been disillusioned around? What's your answer? Why do you step forward? Why do you step into hope instead of a disillusionment? And we train our people to share those stories. Start by acknowledging. Name times where you yourself have been disillusioned and disgusted. And then name some times where you chose something different and why it matters to you now. And that's how we have our conversations with folks about Persuade to Vote.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We have a few more questions coming out of the chat that I think would be important to talk through. So from Mary Jo, can you talk about the organizing work between elections and how it connects to electoral work? What lessons can you share about building a statewide organization?
Yes. So I want to be humble because we're 2 years old. So I'm not out here being like, if y'all just do this, everything's going to work out great. But I will share some things that we're taking away, and we're in our reflection process now. One is the deep relationship building and leadership development that we did in 2019 was essential for the intensity of what happened in 2020. And I'll pull out a few things around that. One, the really basic thing about pace, right? Election time, things start going real fast, real heavy, stakes are really, really high, and everything starts coming out. Whatever conversation you didn't have before elections about relationships between people, whatever comes up for people when they have to face fear, all of those things start stirring when the stakes get high around election time. And in 2019, we engaged in a very depthful, very intentional training process, leadership development process, and chapter formation process that built the core relationships that kept us together during the election. And that included having the difficult conversations about who we endorsed and did not endorse, right? It was a contentious conversation inside of our organization about endorsing Biden. There were contentious conversations about what we called our defensive endorsements, folks who we didn't feel like fully aligned with our values, but were crucial to defend us from the worst of what our main opponents were trying to do. If we hadn't built the relationships and the trust in the year between the presidential election, I don't think our organization would have survived that process, and maybe people would have put their heads down for the short period, but then I think a lot of people would have bounced. So I think it's important in that way in politically forming our people. I think it was also really critical because a good number of our field organizers were people we hired out of our chapter. And so many of our people said to us, I never saw myself doing this, right? Like I had longings or I had hopes, but I never really had the confidence that I could do this. And it was a real process for us to identify leaders and develop their confidence and then ask them in to these roles that massively expanded their opportunity to grow their skill and their confidence as organizers. So I think the time in between was really crucial for that. And then going forward, we're working on building in a number of our chapters platforms for holding candidates accountable and doing co-governance with. And those are things that can't happen when we're in the height of presidential years. So that work in between, I think, is pretty essential. And I've named it a number of times, but the Carolina Federation is made up of county level chapter organizations, as well as what we call affiliate organizations. And those are organizations that have their own 501c4, sorry for the legal language, but have their own kind of legal structure, whereas our chapters use the statewide structure. And then those folks come together in order to make statewide decisions. So our representatives from our chapters and our affiliates, Durham for All, for example, came in and participated in our statewide endorsement process.
Awesome. So I want to kind of talk a little bit or elicit some conversation around independent political organizations. You mentioned that the Carolina Federation is an independent political organization, or IPO. I don't think everyone is as familiar with that particular term and its meaning and the strategy behind it. But can you talk about what the thinking is behind IPOs that get us to long-term and lasting power?
Yes. I think the first thing that I want to say about it is that our assessment is that in order to transform our society, we have to have power. And the question is, what is the power that our people have or could have that could overcome the power of wealth and the entrenched institutional power of our opposition? And when we backed up and looked at it, our analysis was that in this period, the electoral arena is actually a place where we can wield that kind of power. It's not easy, but it is a place where we can wield that kind of power. And in order to do so, we have to have an organization that intentionally accumulates that power and uses it collectively for what we're trying to do. And an independent political organization is an organization that isn't just mobilizing people for the Democratic Party ticket and saying, hey, just turn out for this. It is saying we are building a block of people whose power is very clearly measured in the number of people we can turn out in order to transform electoral outcomes. And we use that leverage to get results on issue fights. We use that leverage in order to replace other candidates who we don't want in there to move our agenda forward. So an IPO is independent of the existing political parties, and for us operates both inside and outside the Democratic Party as a key form of power.
Amazing. Well, let's build some independent political power and organizations all across this country. And we are, again, deeply inspired by the work of the Carolina Federation. And Sendolo, we appreciate your time telling us a little bit more about what y'all are up to and the strategy behind your work. So to our audience tonight, that is our time. If you enjoyed this video, stay up to speed with all the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade. You can sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. Thank you to all who joined us tonight. Sendolo, do you have any parting thoughts for us tonight before we wrap?
I would just really want to encourage people to celebrate this moment that our movements have achieved, and to understand that there's a long arc, and not to lose faith or not to lose the fight in places where down ballot we were not able to succeed. Our movements are growing. Independent political organization works. Let's keep going.
All right, y'all, we have our orders now. Thank you to the brilliant Sendolo Diaminah. Thank you to the production team at Organizing Upgrade. Everyone, please join us next week, same day on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. That's 6 p.m. Central, and of course, 4 p.m. Pacific. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.